Something happened early this January that should have every American paying attention. One of the most respected economic voices in the country just issued a warning so serious, so chilling, that she compared our current situation to the collapse of ancient Rome. We're talking about Janet Yellen, former Federal Reserve Chair and former Treasury Secretary, someone who's held more top economic positions than anyone in American history. On January 4th, 2026, standing before the American Economic Association in Philadelphia, Yellen said something that economists have whispered about for years, but rarely state publicly. She said the preconditions for fiscal dominance are clearly strengthening in the United States. Now, if you don't know what fiscal dominance means, let me break it down, because this matters more than any other economic trend happening right now. Fiscal dominance is what happens when a country's government debt becomes so astronomically large that it handcuffs the central bank. The Federal Reserve loses its ability to fight inflation because raising interest rates, the normal tool for controlling rising prices, would bankrupt the government. At that point, you're facing a choice between three catastrophic outcomes: let the economy collapse under crushing debt payments, default on your obligations and destroy global financial markets, or print money to pay the bills and watch hyperinflation destroy everyone's savings. None of these options are good. All of them are devastating. And according to Yellen, along with a panel of America's most credentialed economists, we're entering that danger zone right now. Let me give you the number that explains everything. $38.4 trillion. That's what the United States government owes as of early January 2026. To put that in context, our entire economy, everything America produces in a year, totals about $32 trillion in gross domestic product. Our debt is now 120% of GDP. We owe more than our entire economic output. And it's accelerating. Every single day, this number grows by over $8 billion. That's $8 billion per day, $334 million per hour, $5.5 million per minute. But here's the number that should absolutely terrify you. $1 trillion. That's how much America pays annually just in interest on this debt. Not reducing the principal, not funding programs or services, just interest. Think about that for a second. In 2020, at the start of the pandemic, our annual interest payment was $345 billion. 6 years later, it's nearly tripled. By 2035, according to Congressional Budget Office projections, it'll hit $1.8 trillion per year. We're now paying more in interest than we spend on Medicare, which keeps elderly Americans alive, more than national defense, which protects the country, more than education, transportation, veterans benefits, and nutrition assistance combined. Interest payments are now the second largest line item in the entire federal budget, behind only Social Security. Every dollar we pay in interest is a dollar that can't build roads, can't fund schools, can't strengthen the military. It goes to bondholders, many of them foreign governments, instead of American citizens. And here's the trap that's already sprung. The more we pay in interest, the more we have to borrow to cover those interest payments, which creates more debt, which generates more interest. It's a doom loop, and we're caught in it. Yellen used a powerful metaphor to explain what's happening. Picture the economy as a car, she said. The Treasury Department is the driver, controlling spending decisions. The Federal Reserve is the brake, controlling inflation by raising or lowering interest rates. Now picture that car towing a $38 trillion trailer behind it. The trailer's weight is so massive that if the Fed hits the brakes too hard by raising interest rates aggressively, the brake system explodes. Why? Because every time rates go up, the government's interest payments spike dramatically. At $38 trillion in debt, even a modest rate increase means tens of billions in additional annual costs. So what happens? The Fed gets forced to ease off the brake even when the car's speeding toward a cliff of runaway inflation, because slamming the brakes would cause an even worse disaster. That's fiscal dominance. The debt becomes so large it controls monetary policy instead of the other way around. The Fed loses its ability to fight inflation effectively, and inflation becomes the only realistic path to dealing with the debt by making it worth less in real terms while destroying everyone's savings in the process. Eric Leeper, a professor at the University of Virginia and former Federal Reserve economist, told Fortune magazine that when Yellen utters that phrase about seeing signs of fiscal dominance, she was partly responsible for creating the problem. He pointed out that as Treasury Secretary, Yellen called on Congress to go big with pandemic spending. She assured everyone not to worry because the Fed had tools to control inflation. Leeper said that shows a fundamental misunderstanding of fiscal dominance. The Fed only has effective tools if we're not already in a fiscal dominant world, and increasingly, we are. Leeper contrasted today with the early 1980s when Paul Volcker raised interest rates to nearly 20% to crush inflation. It worked. But here's why it worked then, and couldn't work now. In 1980, national debt was only 25% of GDP. Because debt was low, it took time for interest rate increases to impact the federal budget significantly. The government had breathing room. Today, debt is 120% of GDP. The impact of rate hikes is instantaneous and massive. If the Fed raised rates to Volcker levels today, interest payments would immediately consume the entire federal budget. It's mathematically impossible. Leeper described what he calls the Hamilton norm. For most of American history, from Alexander Hamilton forward, the expectation was that any debt issued today would eventually get paid off through future tax surpluses. Hamilton established this principle when he assumed state debts after the Revolutionary War and then ran surpluses to pay them down. That norm, Leeper said, ceased to exist in 2020. When Trump put his name on stimulus checks and Biden added trillions more, neither administration even pretended they'd ever pay it back. The debt became treated as a permanent gift to the economy, not a loan requiring repayment. When the public stops viewing government debt as an IOU for future taxes and starts viewing it as free money, Leeper warned, the Federal Reserve loses its grip on inflation expectations. If people don't believe taxes will rise to pay off $38 trillion, they spend their windfall today, driving up prices. In this world, inflation isn't an accident. It's how the crisis resolves itself whether we like it or not. The Congressional Budget Office has run the projections, and they're absolutely horrifying. Under current law, national debt will reach $50 trillion within a decade. That would be 118% of GDP. But that projection was made before recent legislation added trillions more. We're now on track to hit 150% of GDP within 30 years. That's the trajectory of Argentina, of Greece, of the Weimar Republic, historical examples of countries that faced economic catastrophe due to unsustainable debt. And the situation just deteriorated further. On January 22, 2026, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget released a detailed report titled, "What Would a Fiscal Crisis Look Like?" They identified 6 distinct types of crises America could face if debt continues on its current path. Let me walk through each one because every American needs to understand what's potentially coming. First, a financial crisis. Reduced confidence in treasury markets could trigger spiking interest rates, panic selling among traders, asset devaluations, credit market freezing, and major financial institution failures. The report compared this to 2007, when the housing collapse triggered global financial meltdown. Economic output shrank 4%. Unemployment hit 10%. Housing values dropped 25%. Hundreds of institutions failed. Recovery took years. Now imagine that happening because investors lose faith in treasury bonds, supposedly the safest investment on earth. Second, an inflation crisis. To avoid outright default, the Federal Reserve might get forced into monetizing debt by printing money to buy treasury bonds. This happened in Venezuela in the 2010s, Zimbabwe in the 2000s, Argentina repeatedly since the 1960s, and the Weimar Republic in the 1920s. The result is hyperinflation, where prices double every few months and lifetime savings become worthless overnight. Third, an austerity crisis. If market confidence collapses suddenly, lawmakers might get forced to enact massive immediate spending cuts and tax increases to restore faith. The report estimated that fiscal contraction equivalent to 5% of GDP could turn modest growth into 3% economic shrinkage. That would be the deepest recession since the Great Depression. Unemployment would spike, businesses would close, self-reinforcing depression would set in. Greece experienced exactly this in the 2010s when emergency austerity caused the economy to contract by 25%. Fourth, a currency crisis. The dollar could face sudden significant depreciation responding to fiscal stress. Foreign investors would flee. Import prices would surge. The global financial system built on dollar dominance would destabilize. America's ability to import goods and project power would collapse. Every American traveling abroad would see purchasing power evaporate. Every business importing products would see costs explode. Fifth, a default crisis. Although considered very unlikely, if it happened, it would be catastrophic beyond measure. The United States currently owes about $31 trillion to public debt holders. A default would freeze global credit markets, crash stock markets worldwide, and plunge the world into deep recession. Countries like Argentina, Russia, and Greece have defaulted before. The aftermath takes decades to overcome. For America, whose bonds underpin the entire global financial system, a default would be orders of magnitude worse. Sixth, and perhaps most insidious, a gradual crisis. No acute event occurs. Instead, high debt slowly crowds out productive investment year after year. Growth stagnates. Living standards erode. The report pointed to Japan, which has maintained extremely high debt levels for decades without acute crisis, but whose economy has grown only 10% total over 20 years. That's 0.5% annually. An entire generation of Japanese young people has never experienced economic prosperity. The report concluded with a warning that should haunt every policymaker. With debt at 100% of GDP, the United States has less fiscal flexibility than at any point in peacetime history. If another war, pandemic, or recession hits, we can't borrow our way out like we've done previously. That option is disappearing. The next major crisis will find America with its credit card already maxed out. But there's more. The federal government has already borrowed $61 billion in the first 3 months of fiscal year 2026, despite tariffs bringing in tens of billions in additional revenue. Why? Because spending keeps rising faster than revenue. The Congressional Budget Office projects a $1.7 trillion deficit for fiscal 2026. That's 5.5% of GDP in peacetime with no recession. This trajectory is unsustainable by any measure. Meanwhile, proposed defense spending increases could push military budgets from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion annually. That's a 50% increase when we're already drowning in debt. And potential Supreme Court challenges to tariffs could eliminate one of the few new revenue sources. This year's tax season will see a surge in refunds due to recent tax legislation. Revenue is about to drop while spending continues climbing. Heather Long, chief economist for Navy Federal Credit Union, told Fortune that the bond market has become the new king in the United States. She said for most nations, crossing the 120% debt-to-GDP threshold is a game-changer that gives bond investors significant control over the economy. That control manifests through higher borrowing costs for mortgages and car loans, increasingly independent of Federal Reserve decisions. Normally, when the Fed cuts rates, mortgage rates follow. But despite multiple Fed cuts last year, Treasury yields barely budged. The 10-year Treasury yield hit 4.29% in January, nearly as high as before cuts started. Why? Because bond investors are demanding higher returns to compensate for risk that America might not honor obligations. The Fed is cutting, but borrowing costs aren't falling. Normal economic management tools are breaking down. The composition of U.S. debt holders has shifted dramatically. Foreign governments used to hold over 40% of Treasury bonds. They were reliable buyers caring more about stability than returns. Now they hold less than 15%. That reliable investor block, allowing America to borrow at artificially low rates, has disappeared. Who holds the debt now? Profit-driven private investors, hedge funds, banks, insurance companies. These buyers are far more sensitive to risk. If they start doubting America's ability to pay, they'll demand higher rates or refuse to buy entirely. And if they refuse, the only option left is Federal Reserve intervention, buying debt directly. That's monetization. That's the path to inflation crisis. Japan holds the largest foreign position at $1.1 trillion. The United Kingdom is second at $890 billion. China is third at $756 billion. Together, these three hold less than 8% of America's debt. A decade ago, they held substantially more. They've been quietly reducing exposure. They see warning signs. Here's what Yellen said that everyone should hear. Should we be concerned about the potential for fiscal dominance? In my opinion, the answer is yes. Not might be concerned, should be concerned. The former Fed chair, former Treasury Secretary, the most credentialed economic policymaker in the country, is saying yes, we absolutely should be concerned. The preconditions are clearly strengthening, and she admitted her own role in creating this situation. When she led Treasury, she championed massive pandemic spending while assuring everyone the Fed would handle any inflation. She was wrong. Inflation hit 40-year highs. The Fed had to raise rates aggressively, and now debt service costs from those higher rates are consuming the budget. The very policies she promoted brought us to this point. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget put it bluntly. Some form of crisis is almost inevitable. Not might happen. Almost inevitable. The only questions are what type of crisis, when it hits, and how severe it becomes. Let me tell you what this means for you personally. If you have a mortgage, your payments could spike upon refinancing because Treasury yields set baseline mortgage rates. If you have a retirement account, values could crash if financial crisis hits the bond market. If you depend on Social Security, the trust fund is scheduled to run dry in the early 2030s, at which point benefits get cut by 24% automatically. If you work for government or contractors, your job faces risk when austerity hits. If you own a business, your customers will have less to spend as taxes rise and benefits get slashed. The dollar in your pocket loses value daily through inflation the Fed can't control because controlling it would bankrupt the government. Your savings are being eroded, your future is being mortgaged, and those in charge keep adding trillions while assuring you everything's fine. Interest payments now exceed Medicare spending. Let that sink in. Money paid to bondholders exceeds money spent keeping seniors alive. By 2034, interest will reach $1.6 trillion annually. It will absorb $1 in $4 collected through individual income taxes. 1/4 of all income tax you pay will go straight to interest. Not infrastructure, not defense, not education, interest. And here's the trap nobody in Washington wants to discuss. The only ways to reduce debt are raising taxes or cutting spending. But cutting spending means reducing Social Security, Medicare, defense, and other programs voters depend on. Raising taxes means hurting the economy and angering wealthy donors. Neither party will do either, so they keep borrowing, the debt keeps growing, and the crisis keeps approaching. In 1992, Ross Perot ran for president on debt reduction as his main platform. He got nearly 20% of the vote by showing Americans simple charts. Debt at that time was about $4 trillion. Today it's nearly 10 times higher. If Perot were alive now, he'd be screaming from every platform. But there's no Perot today. No voice warning Americans about what's coming. Just politicians from both parties adding trillions while hoping crisis happens on someone else's watch. The Roman Empire debased its currency for centuries before collapsing. Emperors shaved silver from coins to pay for wars and public benefits. Eventually, coins became worthless. Trust evaporated. Economy disintegrated. Empire fell. Yellen compared America to Rome because she sees identical patterns. We're not literally shaving coins, but we're debasing the dollar through inflation and debt. Making promises we can't keep. Spending money we don't have. Eventually, the bill comes due. Yellen warned that if people stop trusting the currency, everything in the economy becomes harder to coordinate. Trust is the foundation of the entire system. Trust that dollars will hold value. Trust that government will pay debts. Trust that contracts will be honored. When trust breaks, the system breaks with it. We're not there yet. The dollar remains the world's reserve currency. Treasury bonds are still considered safe. America can still borrow at rates bankrupting most countries, but margin for error is shrinking. Buffer is gone. One major shock, a war, pandemic, or financial crisis could push us over the edge. What can you do? First, understand government won't save you. Politicians from both parties have shown they'd rather add to debt than make hard choices. Plan accordingly. Second, diversify assets. Don't keep everything in dollar-denominated investments. Gold, real estate, and other stores of value can serve as hedges. Third, reduce personal debt. When interest rates spike, those carrying debt will suffer most. Fourth, build skills and relationships with value regardless of economic conditions. Human capital can't be inflated away. And finally, pay attention. Warning signs are everywhere. Yellen is ringing alarms. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget is spelling out exactly what could happen. Bond markets are showing stress. Foreign governments are reducing holdings. The debt clock is ticking. This isn't theory. This is America in January 2026, staring down 38 trillion in debt that grows larger daily. The Romans thought their empire would last forever. They were wrong. Americans think their economy is too big to fail. They might be wrong too. The difference is, we've been warned. We know what's coming. The question is whether anyone will listen before it's too late. Here at Next Generation Finance, we're committed to bringing you these critical insights before they become mainstream headlines. The decisions made now will determine whether America avoids crisis or walks straight into one. The more people who understand the stakes, the better chance we have of changing course. The clock is ticking. 38 trillion and counting. The point of no return may already be behind us, but until crisis actually hits, there's still time to prepare. Use that time wisely because when the bill comes due, it comes for all of us. This is not financial advice. Always do your own research and consult with qualified professionals before making investment decisions. If you found this breakdown valuable and want to stay ahead of the curve on what's really happening with America's fiscal future, hit that subscribe button right now. These aren't topics you'll see covered honestly on mainstream financial news until it's too late. Drop a comment and let me know. Do you think America will course correct, or are we heading straight for one of those 6 crisis scenarios? Your perspective matters, and I read every comment.